Welcome, everybody. Thank you. We're gonna hop right in to be aware of the time. My name is Lisa, and we have Matt here tonight with Revolution's Newsstand, and speaking on the revolutionary life and writings of Mary E. Marcy. I'll be here helping in the chat box if you need anything.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. If you have any questions as we go along, please put them in the chat box and Lisa will take care of it. My name is Matt Siegfried and I'm the host of Revolution's Newsstand, where we look at the left in the period from its founding in the United States until about World War II. And tonight, we're going to be talking about Mary E. Marcy. And there's a photo of her there. And I've been in the left my entire life, since my teenage years, and it was decades in the left before I heard the name Mary Marcy. And it was even longer than that before I really knew who she was. And when I found out who she was, I was ashamed that we had no idea who Mary Marcy was. And it seemed to me a symptom of a larger problem of the break in traditions in the United States and the revolutionary traditions. Mary Marcy, I think for anybody in the left at the time that Mary Marcy was alive, they would be shocked to know that we don't know who Mary Marcy was. She was a central figure in the left, not just in terms of activism, but in terms of defining the role of the left, of defining what revolutionary Marxism looked and sounded like in the United States before the Russian Revolution. And we have a very, very rich tradition of revolutionary Marxism before the Russian Revolution, of which Mary is an exemplary example or an exemplary person of. So Mary is an exceptional person. She is the person more responsible than any other human being for bringing the economic ideas of Karl Marx to the working class in the United States. And I think we need to underline the fact that that was a working class woman who did that in her 20s and 30s and 40s. She was also, I think, a person of her time and place. And so we're going to talk a little bit about her time and place. One of the things that is relevant to all of this is that Mary has not been thoroughly researched. When I was doing this, I realized that there are still lots of mysteries out there about Mary. In fact, there's never been a real biography written of Mary, this central figure. And there's a couple of reasons for that, and we'll talk about them at the end. But let's get started with the revolutionary life and writings of Mary Marcy by first looking at the kind of where the context she begins in. Let's see if we can move my, okay. There it goes, right?
It didn't move for us. Maybe share and re stop share and reshare.
Let's do that.
Yep, just got a little
Okay.
stuck.
Let's try it again. I'm sorry, everybody. One moment. Sorry about that, everyone. Okay, so Mary was born in 1877, and that's 12 years after the Civil War. That is in the period of mass industrialization. 1877 is, in fact, the year Mary was born is the year of the greatest working class uprising in the United States history, the mass rising of railroad workers in the summer of 1877 that saw many hundreds of people killed, and a commune formed in St. Louis for a few days. It was the height of post-war radicalism in the United States. That is the year Mary was born, 1877. So she's born at the end of Reconstruction, and at the most violent year outside of the Civil War in American history in some ways, 1877, which saw the retreat in the South, and in the North, it saw the putting down of this working class uprising. So Mary is born into the process of industrialization. She's going to be born probably in southern Illinois. We're a little unclear of which town south of Chicago. She will spend most of her time in Chicago. She is part of that industrialization, part of that urbanization, part of that people coming from the farms that are being that are falling to the wayside, these family farms towards agribusiness and migratory labor, and people are moving to the cities to get jobs in factories. And also with this is the Great Migration of millions of people coming from the South to work in places like Chicago, in the meat packing industry and steel industry, etc. There are rich around 1900 that we have rich trade unions, but they're very limited, right? So we have the American Federation of Labor, which is craft unionism, which is basically an exclusive kind of unionism. So you organize all the people who do the same kind of work that you do, and it's usually so-called skilled work, right? So that's the American Federation of Labor. And then you have, by far, for generations, it was the largest working class organization in the United States by a long shot, was the United Mine Workers. And the United Mine Workers is in the AFL, but it's different. As you can imagine, in a mine, everybody needs to be in the same union. And so the United Mine Workers, by necessity, was an industrial union, meaning everybody in the industry was in the same union. And that gave it huge amounts of power. The UMW is by far the most militant. It is not centralized at this point by John L. Lewis. That'll happen after Mary passes. You have in the West, you have an insurgent Western Federation of Miners that comes out of Colorado, Idaho, Wyoming. This is going to be the wellspring of working class radicalism that will lead to the IWW. It will lead to the Socialist Party, many of those things. Debs has a very famous article called The Western Labor Movement on the Western Federation of Miners. We'll meet them again. And then there's something called the American Labor Union, which is a competitor to the American Federation of Labor, which seeks to organize on an industrial basis. It is sort of a precursor to the CIO, and it will be one of the founders of the IWW in 1905. But again, there is no IWW. Most of these unions will not allow Black members. Many of them are language unions. So you have the Hebrew Union Federation, German unions, Czech unions. So they're very exclusive. They're not inclusive like the United Mine Workers. Also in 1900, we have U.S. imperialism coming onto the world stage for the first time. So in 1898, you've got the United States so-called Spanish-American War, when the United States steals the colonies of Spain in the Caribbean and the Pacific. The Philippines, Puerto Rico is still a United States colony. Cuba, of course, got their liberation in 1859 or 1959, but it was a U.S. colony for all of those years. So U.S. imperialism, all of what that means was also happening right around the time that Mary's in her 20s. And it's also the period of trusts and monopolies, where we've got great conglomerations of businesses and industry. U.S. imperialism and those trusts also have created a new middle class and a new bureaucracy, one that didn't exist before, and that challenges some of the Marxist notions about the disappearance of the middle class, right? That U.S. imperialism has created an industrial and military bureaucracy that reinvigorates a sort of a middle class mentality. And this is noticed by a lot of people at the time, including people like Edward Bernstein in Germany, who will write revisionist evolutionary socialism, right? So that part of the conflicts that we'll see in the socialist movement are a response, very much a response to a new imperialism. And then we have political movements on the left in the United States. We have a Marxism. It is a German Marxism. There is a U.S. populism around the Bryan movement, the West, the single tax. We have two by 1901, we have two dominant socialist parties. There's Deb's Social Democratic Party, which becomes the Socialist Party in 1901. And then there's the older Socialist Labor Party led by Daniel De Leon. And the Socialist Labor Party would be explicitly anti-revisionist. The Debs movement would be a big tent with lots of people, including colonists, which we don't really have anymore, but at that time it was very big. And it was, think of it what it means. It was not colonizing the way we think of an imperialism. It was to create communes. America, the United States used to have lots of sort of small communes in Indiana, religious-based, industrial-based, etc. But in there was a socialist colonization movement in the late 1900s. So get out of the cities, create communal industry in Wyoming or wherever, and all go out there and live. So that was a real part of the movement. Deb's Socialist Party comes to fore with the split, with saying we don't want colonism, we want political socialism. That's where the Deb's Party comes from. And of course, there are rich anarchisms of all varieties in 1900. We don't have a communist party. We don't have in 1900, we don't have a single socialist party the way that Deb's Socialist Party would become predominant over the next decade or 2 decades, and the Socialist Labor Party would become relatively irrelevant by 1920, when it was much more relevant earlier. And then, of course, the class war. So Labor Day is celebrated because the 1894 Pullman strike was crushed by the Democratic Party right before the 1894 by-elections that summer, and they needed to make an appeal to working class people, and that's why we got Labor Day out of 1894. Of course, there's a larger history behind it than that. But one of the things to remember is there was this massive industrial union strike in 1894 that was defeated, that was crushed by federal government intervention, which was a precedent that we still see today. So let's look at Mary's early life, and we're still having problems. There it is. Okay. So again, Mary is born in 1877 to Cyrus Tobias and Mary Beneday. It's a little unclear of where her parents are from. They move around a lot. It seems that her father was a door-to-door salesman, perhaps a bit of a ne'er-do-well. Three of her youngest siblings died relatively young, so it's Mary and two siblings who survive. Both of Mary's, and this is key to Mary, and we'll see how it affects her writing and her perspectives later. But Mary is orphaned young from a working class family. She's the oldest surviving child. By the time both of her parents are dead, by the time she's about 15. And so she has to take care of Hazel, her younger sister, and Roscoe, her younger brother. Roscoe Tobias, also called Toby. We'll meet both of these who are also her comrades later. So I think they go and live with family for a while. We see that she's living at a boarding house in Chicago. She's living a tough life of an orphaned working class, very young woman taking care of two younger siblings. She gets a job at as a telephone operator, which is where many women, young single women, could get jobs. It was called Hello Girls, and you can imagine sexual harassment, exploitation, and those places were extreme. She's living with her younger brother. Her daughter or her younger sister marries quite young. Mary does graduate high school. She graduates from the newly opened Evanston High in North Chicago, a suburb of Chicago at that time. And as she's going to high school, working as a telephone operator, and raising her siblings, she goes to stenography correspondence school at night. And she gets a job at a flag factory in Chicago, of all places, an American flag factory. And in 1896, she's a single taxer. She's 19 years old, 20 years old, maybe still a teen. She's involved in the single tax movement, which was around Henry George. I don't have time to go into it, but it was a populist movement that would only tax land as a way to be as a way to encourage people to smallholders. To encourage smallholders, and so she went to work one day wearing her Bryan button. There you see 1896, William Jennings Bryan, who was the populist candidate in 1896, and she was fired from her job, from the conservatives on her job as a secretary of this flag factory. And because of Darrow's renown in Chicago, a man heard about this young woman being fired for wearing that button. That man was Clarence Darrow, of all people, the great uh, lawyer, at this time, quite a radical person who would become more liberal over his life, but at this time, quite radical, based in Chicago. And Clarence Darrow got Mary a job because she was fired at the University of Chicago, being the secretary for one of the University of Chicago was just being formed at that time, and got Mary a job as secretary for one of the deans of the University of Chicago. So Mary can take classes at the University of Chicago without getting without having to pay tuition. They're not credited classes, but she takes classes at night as she's working as a stenographer, as a secretary, and so she takes classes from people like John Dewey, believe it or not, right? This working class woman who was orphaned 5 years, she's now taking class. She's clearly also motivated, right? She's clearly very motivated. Now, around this time as well, um, the Socialist Party is formed in 1901, and Mary will join that, if not that year, immediately after. She marries a man. This is where she gets her last name, Marcy. She marries a comrade, a member of the Socialist Party, previously, Leslie Hanson Marcy, born in Ohio, who's a comrade and will become a life partner, complicated, with Mary. They join the Socialist Party together. And I think one of the things, there's a couple of books that come out in this period that are really going to be influential to Mary. And right around the late 1900s, August Bebel's Women in Socialism got its first large translation into English, and it would get a further translation in the next 10 years. But it cannot be underestimated the impact that August Bebel's book had on women, especially women who read it. It placed women at the center of the socialist discussion and socialist debate, and it also gave women a history, right? That predates capitalism. And so it was an incredibly impactful book. In fact, there's not a major woman writer of that time in socialism where you don't see the relevance of August Bebel's book, and the look at the transformation of societies from matriarchies to patriarchies. That transformation became a key way of understanding the world for radical women. And that was first thoroughly explained in English by Bebel. We'll learn Engels in a moment. So Mary certainly would have read those books. She's clearly a voracious reader, and as we go forward, what she writes, you can tell what she's reading. And so let's go. Mary's first actual writing is called A Satire in Civilization and Other Fables. So she's a young radical. There she is on the left. Um, and she's a single taxer there. And it's interesting. The Satire on Civilization and Other Fables has it's a kitchen sink book. There's only one copy, I think, in the Newberry Library. It was privately published. And so there's poems in it, there's essays in it, it ends with a play, right? So Mary will revisit all of those forms of writing later in her life. Now, a key thing happens in this period that will change not just Mary, but change the socialist movement, and that is her meeting with Charles H. Kerr, which you see right there. Now, Charles H. Kerr, many of you will have a book published by Charles H. Kerr in your library. In fact, many of the classic works of Marxism that we read today were first translated by Charles H. Kerr's company. He began as a Unitarian, a radical Unitarian, and by the late 1890s, he moved towards Marxism. And by the early 1900s, he by 1900, he had committed to the publication of socialist works, Marxist works for U.S. workers in a way that they would be able to read and absorb. He wanted to bring the works of Marx to U.S. workers, and that was his life's mission, and he achieved it. So the reason we have Capital, volumes 1, 2, and 3 is in English is because Charles H. Kerr organized that and had them translated and was able to get a grant from Joseph Dietzken's son of $1,000 to send somebody to Florida to live at a chicken farm for 2 years, Ernest Unterman, and translate Karl Marx's Volume 3. And so Charles Kerr, not just the works of Marx, but the works of Paul Lafarge, the works of Karl Kautsky, all of the European figures, right? And so there's a book publishing concern called the Charles H. Kerr Cooperative. It would become a cooperative. It still exists. In fact, there's a lockout right now, I think, by the union employees of Charles H. Kerr. And Kerr also put out, as edited by A.M. Simons, Algie Simons, the International Socialist Review, which is the most important left-wing publication in U.S. history. And I'm going to say it's also the best, would become the best. It's not the best at this point, but it will become the best under the leadership of Mary Marcy. Charles Kerr and Mary Marcy, I don't want to, Mary Marcy has a complicated personal life. And I really don't want to go into her personal life in as much as it doesn't affect her politics, because also a lot of it is a mystery and it's hidden behind letters that we don't have. And so it would just be speculation. But one thing is clear is that Mary Marcy and Charles H. Kerr had an affair. More than that. In fact, at the 1904 Socialist Party convention, Charles Kerr, who is married, introduces Mary as his wife. His own wife overhears that and they get divorced. Mary and Charles will have a relationship, even though Mary is married to Leslie. The three of them, I think, also have a larger relationship, which we'll get into. These are countercultural lives. These are, I They're not dilettantes, but they are bohemians. They live as free of lives as they can, and that will conflict with emotions and politics and this and that. And we'll see Mary write about some of this later, and we'll see more about their relationship. Kerr is an incredibly important person, and there is no way to talk about the U.S. left without talking about Charles H. Kerr and the partnership that Kerr and Marcy made over the next 20 years redefines US politics. So there are the International Socialist Review is edited by A.M. Simons, Algie Simons, who is very much a revisionist in the Bernstein sense, but in an American sense. So we don't have mass working class political parties for which to be a revisionist for here, right? So in America, it becomes advocating things like a Labor Party rather than a socialist party, things like that. So it was called trimming the socialist project, and Kerr will over time split definitively with Algie Simons and those revisionists. And that split will bring Mary Marcy in to rebuild ISR. So that background is really important to understanding the change that happens to ISR over the next couple of years. Mary gets a she moves with her husband Leslie to Kansas City, and there she gets a job as the stenographer for the treasurer of the Armor meatpacking plant. And boy, are they going to regret that. Because Mary begins her first writing project. Let's see, yeah, there we Mary begins her first writing project for Charles H. Kerr's International Socialist Review. And it is a really what a way to start. So it is called Letters from a Pork Packer's Stenographer. And like all of Mary's early writings, and we're going to see, it's not until about 1910, 1911 that she'll write in her own voice. She's creating metaphors and stories with which to write, and a lot of it comes directly out of her personal experiences. So she uses her her experience at the Armor meatpacking plant to write these letters of a pork packer stenographer. And the conceit is she's a new person coming to politics and writing to a friend in Chicago about life in the meatpacking plant, right? It is a bit like calling Rosa Parks just a tired lady who sat at the back of the bus. There was a plan here. Mary was going to expose these people. And so she writes these letters and anonymously, and they're both fictitious and real. They're brilliant. And over the course of about a year and a half, Mary's ideas are emerging, and you can see you don't know how much of it is planned and how much of it is just her literally politically growing as she's doing this. But this is before Upton Sinclair's the Jungle comes out. And in 19, you see here, demure young woman knows trust secrets. Mary Marcy was not a demure young woman, but she did know their secrets. And in 1905, she exposes their secrets in public. And so at some hearings on the meatpacking industry, she comes out and says everything that she learned and names names and names money and follows money and loses her job, of course. But this is Mary's first time that she becomes known, not just in the left, but nationally. So she's in newspapers, as a whistleblower. She's a whistleblower. Uh, uh, Around this time, so that's her first big writing project. It gets her fired, and it leads her into the public sphere definitively. Uh, she needs another job, so she goes and gets a job again at Kansas City at the Associated Charities, and she then begins a series immediately after the Pork Packer Stenographer called Out of the Dump, about working class people having to navigate charities. And this is anti-charity, right? This is written by somebody who knew about waiting in line for a little bit of food in Chicago to take home to her siblings, and knew that sometimes you went to the charity and would end up getting arrested. Like charity was dangerous. And it was also paternalistic and all of those things. And Out of the Dump is a remarkable story, and then it includes a young person whose family dies young and has to there's a lot of Mary's story also in Out of the Dump. So that's her second. It's kind of a follow-on to Pork Packer Stenographer. So again, they're fictitious and deeply real, right? They're fictitious and deeply real. And one of the people she meets in this period who's going to do, she loves artists, right? And she likes to collaborate with artists. And what the first artist she really collaborates with and will collaborate with the rest of her life is the great wobbly Ralph Chaplin. So the guy who wrote Solidarity Forever, that's Ralph Chaplin. He was a great wobbly poet, writer, artist, activist, friend of Joe Hill, carried Joe Hill's coffin, a remarkable person. And in fact, some of the most intimate details of Mary's life comes from his 1944 biography, Wobbly. We have very few details of Mary's life, but he's going to work on Out of the Dump with Mary, and then Leslie, and Ralph will create these socialist playing cards. And there is only apparently one entire complete deck left. And I just saw that it's up for auction in Britain. And so it belongs in a museum of socialism. But of course, we need a museum of socialism first for that to go into. But but so you could see that Mary is a creative person as well as a political person. She then in 1908, she becomes, after she loses her other job at the Associated Charities, she becomes the secretary for the Kerr Publishing Company. And as she is secretary for the Kerr Publishing Company, A.M. Simons is moved out of ISR. A split happens in ISR in which Kerr decides that he's going to embrace the new industrial unionism and the new radicalism that is epitomized by the IWW, founded in 1905. And to do that, he's going to ask Mary to come on as an associate editor. By 1908, Mary is the lead associate editor of International Socialist Review. So she's 31. She becomes the lead editor in 1908. And it's at this point that Mary can now speak with her own voice. And one of the things we think, you read ISR and you see a lot of uncredited writing, and you would assume that it's by Charles Kerr, the editor. As you read more and more, you see it's Mary Marcy's voice, and she'll begin writing in aliases. She'll begin writing in other different, and to find when I found out a slew of her aliases and realized that were 40 more Mary Marcy articles out there I had never read, it was a thrill. Why she uses those aliases, I'm a little unsure. I think part of it is to just not overload ISR with her writings, right? So there's not 4 Mary Marcy articles in each issue. Part of it is clearly when she wants to push the envelope a little bit and go outside of accepted ideas. She'll create a character and then write something, right? Um, uh, in 1907, she writes her first her first intervention into the politics of the Socialist Party. And it's called The Blanktown Man, and it is a brutal poem that she wrote about, I think, A.M. Simons and the revisionists and the the professors of the party, as she would call them. Mary, I think Mary detested the intellectual man who threw a lot of ideas on the table and walked out the door. She detested that. She detested that. So you can read that poem, The Blanktown Man. I'm sure A.M. Simons was uh, very happy with that. He went on to publish the second daily English language socialist paper in the United States, the Chicago Daily Socialist. And that ran daily for 7 or 8 years, and I don't think there's a single Mary Marcy article in the Chicago Daily Socialist. So she's living in Chicago. She's one of the most renowned socialists in America, and the Chicago Daily Socialist won't print her articles because of this split, and it's a real split. Um, she also, but look at the numbers. So when she began to edit ISR, it had a circulation of 3,000, and it was largely led by preachers and professors. By 1910, it had a circulation of 27,000. By 1912, a circulation of 40,000. She changed the structure of the magazine. What she did is one, she said, we want working class writers, and two, we want writers who are writing about the struggles they're engaged in. So we don't want an analysis from the professor. We want the article from the union organizer about the strike. Now, that doesn't mean that Mary was an anti-intellectual. That's not at all what I mean. She was deeply intellectual, and she wanted the review to cover the full range of intellectual ideas and experience and debates. So the review then, and she wanted workers needed to be armed with all kinds of ideas, not just Marxism, but they needed to know science. They needed to know anthropology. They needed to know the weather. They needed to know about comets. They needed to know everything, right? That the world was that big. So International Socialist Review changes. It begins instead of just nothing but long form articles. It gets a variety: long form articles, paragraph articles, theoretical articles, agitational articles, many photographs. They're using every new technology they can. We look at these magazines and think of them as old, but of course they're new. To be able to put color into your magazine, to be able to put photographs into your magazine, all of that was new and made ISR a really vibrant, cutting edge, new magazine, especially under her leadership. It's what I call the American Iskra. It's the center of the discussion. It's where all of the discussion in the U.S. left can happen. Even, again, the Chicago Daily Socialist won't allow the left wing in. The New York Daily Call won't allow the left wing in. International Socialist Review will have these debates. We'll have these debates. The Charles H. Kerr Company puts out in 1906 Engels's The Origin of Private Property, Family, and the State. That is clearly a defining book for Mary Marcy. Almost immediately after that comes out, she begins her third of her big series. So her first big three writings are not, again, they're not agitational. And the third big series of her writings is called Stories of Cave People. And she goes back to tribal societies, right? And basically tells Engels's Morgan via Engels, Lewis Henry Morgan via Engels's ideas about matriarchy becoming patriarchy, the dissolution of tribal societies, all of that kind of thing, the invention of new technologies, etc. So that's as big as Mary's world. So if she wants to tell that story, she's going to have to tell that story 10,000 years ago, right? And so she begins her stories of cave people, which will be, all of these will be published as books, not pork packer stenographer. That will just stay as articles. Okay. So by 1905, the Industrial Workers of the World has been formed. The Industrial Workers of the World was formed of a real coming together of different forces. So you have the Socialist Labor Party coming together. You have the left wing of the Socialist Party coming together. Debs is there. You have the anarchists and syndicalists coming together. You've got people who are just union radicals coming together. So between 1905 and about 1910, there's a sense of radicalism and the coming together, right? That'll split apart afterwards. But so notions of working class unity are on the table. Should all of these groups should the IWW then have a political party as a reference? And it won't be until a couple of years until the IWW becomes anti-political, right? And so you have Socialist Party, anarchists, trade unionists, socialist labor, all working in one organization, the IWW. And it's a radical working class organization. You must be a wage earner to join the IWW. No cockroach lawyers allowed in the IWW, right? And so it is truly a proletarian organization, a working class organization. And Bill Haywood is a central figure of that, of course. And Bill Haywood and the IWW will be headquartered where? In Chicago. It won't certainly be the site of their greatest strength. The IWW had a bit of a hard time organizing in large cities where the AFL was strong, but it will be their headquarters. So Mary is at the place where the headquarters of the IWW is. Mary is a political socialist, a revolutionary political socialist. So she is not a syndicalist, but she deeply appreciates industrial unionism and sees that expansive, inclusive idea of unionism, which takes in people of different races, which takes in men and women, which does not care about this skilled versus unskilled BS, and places at the front of the working class the proletariat, the people without tools, right? That is Mary's politics. That's Mary's politics. And so I think there is a sense. Now, again, this is before the Russian Revolution. This is before the New Deal. This is before lots of things, right? The world is, how are we going to do this thing? How are we going to transform the world was a very open question. It still is, obviously, but it was a very open question. And I think that there is a sense that there's a sense that if you could just explain surplus value to the working class, if they could just realize their position in society, that they were being stolen from at every moment of their working day by the boss at work, if you could just make that clear, then nobody likes to be thieved from, then people would resist that thievery. And there is a real sense that if you could just explain surplus value correctly, then you would get to socialism because it was such a compelling way of looking at it for any worker. When you realize surplus value and you realize you're being stolen from every day at work, it's mind blowing, right? And it blew Mary's mind, and they wanted to bring that to the working class. But we have a working class at that point in the United States, which is completely polyglot. I think the industrial proletariat, the people working at the steel mills and the coal mines are going to be, by about 1910, 1920, are going to be majority foreign born, especially the unskilled workers. And then of course you have many black workers coming to the north at the same time, working in these same steel mills. So you needed to approach workers in a way that you could speak to all of them together at the same time. And that was very difficult, right? It still is difficult. There's a reason Marx wrote Workers of the World Unite. And it was not because the workers were already united. It's because they were not. And it was the imperative that they unite. And that still is, right? And so how are we going to get these very disparate groups, racially disparate, ethnically disparate, linguistically disparate, to to think in common terms, right? Unions can do that, and then a class notion can do that. And so Mary begins. Finally, we get Mary now. She's going to speak in her own terms, agitationally. She's not creating metaphors. She's going to write about Marx. Now, 1909, third volume of Capital is released by the corporation, and she clearly reads it. She reads it immediately. And she begins in November 1910 the beginner's course in socialism and the economics of Karl Marx. That will become Shop Talks on Economics. It will be the most important text ever created by anybody in bringing the ideas of Marx and Marxism, economic ideas of Marx and Marxism to the working class. And it is it's part of the Kerr project, right? It's part of this larger project. And the Shop Talks on Economics is written in such a way as it's designed for the one person who's literate at the shop to be able to read to the rest of the shop during lunch who are not literate and speak 7 different languages, right? That is how Marcy wrote the book. She wrote that book to be talked about in the shop in that situation. And so when you read it, I think it's important that you're reading this as as simplified in language as you can make it, because it's literally going to be translated at the shop. That's what it was designed to do. And so she gives little lessons, and then at the end of lessons are questions and things to make you think. It is a remarkable piece of work. It would sell millions of copies, 2 million copies in the next 20 years. And you can't imagine how many times it was handed from person to person, right? So 2 million copies is just the tip of the iceberg of how many people read and studied Shop Talks on Economics. It became huge, right? And in fact, the largest single edition of it was in 1920, and it was the Chinese version. It was the first Chinese version, and I think it went out in 100,000 copies at that point, something close to that. And so that's the growth that had. That it's the most important single Marxist economic text ever written in the United States in terms of its impact on actual workers, right? There's many other more important texts theoretically, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of its impact, workers reading it, this is the book. I would love that workers would sit down and read all 3 volumes of Capital. Highly unlikely. That's a task. That's a task. Now, I think that is this propaganda or education? Right? What's the difference? Um, there is a sense of we might call some of this economy vulgar today, meaning simplified, not meaning stupid or ugly, meaning simplified, right? And of course it is, right? She's writing it simplistically for the broadest audience possible. That doesn't mean, I think, that we should say that they're vulgar economists, right? I think that they're trying to reach the working class. And in that division in the working class is that craft industrial division. And that's going to be a racial division. It's going to be an ethnic division. It's going to be a language division. It's going to be a political division. So often you will see in strikes during this period that the so-called unskilled workers, non-union workers, will go out on strike to be scabbed on by the skilled workers of the AFL. That happens over and over and over and over again. And so it's an imperative for either side of that debate that they join in one common union. It's an imperative, right? But how do you do that? And the IWW clearly is not interested in trying to win the AFL to that. Mary is very much interested in challenging the AFL, right? She's very much interested in challenging the AFL. She went through the 1910 Chicago garment strike, right? Which is we get in 1910, 11, 12, we get a series of hundreds of thousands of largely women immigrants in New York, Chicago, Kansas City, Pittsburgh, going out on strike in textile factories. And Chicago was the first, and in some ways the start of that. And she watched the AFL destroy that strike, right? All these young women come out and she watched them destroy that strike. So that's happening at the same time she's writing all of these. There's also a real division between West and East. You have much more migratory labor out west, not just in agriculture, but in industry than you do out east. And it, because of that, you get a much more radicalism out west. Often the most radical elements of the working class are those stateless, shiftless elements of the working class, right? Who don't have an allegiance to an existing community, et cetera, et cetera, forced into that migratory work by capital. There is an important women's socialist magazine at this point, and an important women's socialist movement in Chicago. It's around what was called the progressive woman or the socialist woman. And we're going to talk a little bit later about how Mary relates to socialist women's movement. She was opposed to having any separate women's organizations. She demanded that women have full access to all male organizations, but she did not support women's separate trade unions. She did not support. So, for example, there's never a women's section of ISR. Most of the socialist magazines at this time will have a women's, section or something like that. That doesn't exist in ISR. Mary sees much of the suffrage movement. That doesn't mean she's opposed to suffrage. She is not. She sees much of the suffrage movement as an alien class force, right? A middle class force. Mary is first and foremost concerned with working class people. And for her, that means the vast majority of people. And in she is not interested in a women's rights divorced from the working class. That's simply not what she's interested in. At the same time, International Socialist Review will have the most far-sighted articles on abortion and birth control, on eugenics, on marriage, on divorce, right? So all of her positions on these questions are far to the left of the feminist and socialist movement, right? But she primarily relates to the organized working class, absolutely male dominated movement. I think Mary is under 5 foot tall, and she is in there pushing with her elbows with Big Bill Haywood and those kind of people, right? So, is Mary a feminist? Absolutely. Would Mary have called herself a feminist? I doubt it. I doubt it. Would she call herself a revolutionary working class woman? Absolutely. Again, we talked about the Chicago Daily Socialist and immigration. Here's some of her aliases. Jack Morton. She uses Max Romer, Jack Morton, Edna Tobias, Jim Morton, a couple of others. So if you see those, that's also Mary. Now, her younger brother, Roscoe, is both of her younger brother and sister are involved in politics. Her younger brother Roscoe is young working class person. He gets a job at a newspaper. It's called a spot knocker, which is an old version of Photoshop, right, for newspapers. And he works with Ralph Chaplin. And Roscoe's a working class guy, and he's in the IWW. He's a migratory worker, and he uses his skills as a lithographer to counterfeit money for the movement and for other things. And so he's arrested a number of times, right? And he does time. So Mary's family is, you know, in and out of jail, right? It's a world she knows. Roscoe is probably in some ways a more bohemian radical than Mary. He's certainly in and out of trouble. He seems like a real character, very interesting. He also writes for ISR about his work as a lithographer, and we'll meet him a little bit later. He will be a champion of Mary's his whole life. All right, can we go forward? Okay, the March of the Machine. As I was saying, Mary wanted a full education for workers. So, ISR and the Charles Kerr Company publish all of these scientific works, Marxism and Darwinism. This one, Caroline Nelson, who's a figure a lot like Mary in her own way, who's deserves to be. In fact, maybe in a couple of weeks we'll do a Caroline Nelson version of this because she's also deserving of a lot of attention that is not given. She was Danish-born revolutionary socialist on the West Coast, who, again, the nature talks on economics. You can see that they're bringing these ideas, those Bebel and science and all of these things, and putting them together. They want to create working class intellectuals. Again, they are not anti-intellectual. They want to create working class intellectuals. They say, as Louis Duchesne says, this young Ohio, he's actually from Palestine, Ohio, where the big train wreck happened. He's buried there. In fact, he was a coal miner who became an IWWer and a socialist who died of tuberculosis, like so many of our comrades did back then. And he writes an article called "The Proletarian Attitude," which Mary puts in to ISR, which talks specifically about we're not anti-intellectuals. It's just workers have different interests than a professor's intellectually, and we want to engage those interests, and we want to and if workers are going to self-emancipate, then they have to be the intellectual leaders. Now remember, we're talking about a working class that is probably just in its majority literate, right? 55, 60%, something like that. Most people, my father was the first person in his family to ever graduate high school, right? Like most people did not graduate high school. The idea of going to college as a working class person is a post World War II idea, right? So even reading and having access to this information was a revolutionary thing. And Kerr puts out so many books on these. And Kerr's also a vegetarian. He's deeply interested in animal rights and things like that. And so they're putting up all of those kind of books. Mary goes down on you could tell her interests are absolutely massive. So she writes this wonderful article, which I just posted, called 100 Years Ago, looking at and that's what one is directly addressed to women to think of their grandmothers and how their grandmothers lived, how they live. How would you expect your granddaughters to live? It's a wonderful, wonderful article. The Busy Silkworm, where she follows the silk from the cocoon in Japan all the way to the dyeing process in Passaic, New Jersey. The Food Destroyers, about overproduction of food when there's hungry. She wrote an amazing, you wouldn't think that an article by a Marxist on advancement in the canning industry would be fascinating, but it's fascinating. And so is her early article on auto car making. She was deeply interested in the revolutions that were happening in Detroit. And then she she goes outside for the first time of the United States and starts thinking about and this is primarily because the Mexican Revolution makes internationalists of American socialists before the Russian Revolution does, right? And so Mary starts thinking about capitalism internationally. I mean, she's always done that, but she starts really thinking about it with the U.S. intervention into Mexico, with the discussions on imperialism. So after Roger Casement's article came out on the destruction of native populations for the rubble industry, she wrote The Morals in Rubber. She wrote a fascinating thing about German industry replacing the Turkish harem. She wrote about capital in Guatemala, and she wrote about where furs come from around the world. Now, there's a couple of things to say about her internationalism uh and and like reading Roger Casement and what imperialism was doing to native populations. So her view, I think at this point, would have been these people want to bring capitalism to Guatemala to create workers who will destroy capital. Go at it. Because this was before This was before the Russian Revolution. This was a kind of evolutionary idea, right? Workers, the capitalism will create its own grave diggers. It's an evolutionary inevitability. It's an evolutionary inevitability. Now, revolutions play a part in this, absolutely. We're not on the sidelines, but it's like holding back the tide. It's like holding back the tide would be the her position at this point. And it's very interesting to see how that evolutionary notion bumps up against World War One. And then you have to rethink the evolution, the inevitability of socialism and the transformation of society. And we'll see that. So there's a kind of evolutionary notion that bumps up into reality, and Mary will turn that evolutionary notion on its head. Okay, so industrial socialism and the trimmers. Mary and ISR are going to lead the struggle in the first big struggle in the Socialist Party between left and right was around Bill Haywood's run for the National Executive Committee in 1911. There was a conscientious effort on the part of International Socialist Review and the left of the Socialist Party to intervene and try to stem the after the collapse of unity negotiations with the social and people left the Socialist Party made a rightward shift, and they wanted to try to stem the tide of that rightward shift. And so they created a lyceum, a speakers bureau, and would send Frank Bone, another leader of the left, and William D. Haywood around the country to build this left wing campaign. That resulted in Haywood's overwhelming victory in late December 1911 for election into the NEC. So he's elected to the top 7-person leadership of the entire Socialist Party as a revolutionary. And when Haywood is elected, literally he says to Morris Hillquit and Victor Berger, "And now after me come the black people." That was the notion. We're going to break this thing open, right? And Haywood is absolutely, if there is the embodiment of revolutionary working class consciousness in the United States, it's William D. Haywood. And the relationship between Mary and William D. Haywood was intense. It was real. I There is much speculation about the two of them. I don't want to speculate other than to say that they had a very close relationship, so close that William D. Haywood doesn't even mention her in his lengthy autobiography. And I think there's some reasons for that, which we can talk about later. Mary was the central defining voice. Haywood is out there, but she's the editor of the magazine Haywood writes for, right? She's this is before cell phones, it's before the internet. If you ever go through Chicago, you're going to stop at the offices of ISR and talk to Mary Marcy because you've been corresponding with her about her, right? Like it's that kind of open world, right? And so Mary's at the center of that. And they publish what if there's if there's one book you're going to read to think about what revolutionary socialism looked and sounded like in the United States before the Russian Revolution, it's Industrial Socialism by William D. Haywood and Frank Bond. It is a revolutionary Marxist text. Frank Bond comes out of the Socialist Labor Party. William D. Haywood, of course, comes out of the Western Federation of Miners. And again, William D. Haywood's image as sort of this tough gunslinging union person is an image he liked to foster. He was extremely conscious about what he was doing. He was extremely conscious about politics and the working class. He was a real leader. He was a real leader. He was the leader in some ways. And this book becomes central. And Mary will defend that book uh, in 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 the ISR, and revolutionary socialism around this time will be called industrial socialism to to separate it from that kind of AFL exclusive socialism. This is an industrial inclusive socialism. Inspired by ISR in this campaign, there are a number of new left-wing newspapers that have similar politics that come out in the United States. Revolt in San Francisco, Justice in Pittsburgh, The Wage Slave in a little town in northern Michigan called Hancock. And these are just a few. There's many, many, many more uh, and that have the language of ISR and the IWW. So the issues around here, which really separate Mary and these left-wing comrades from the right wing, are real questions of organizing and action, right? They're not theoretical questions about did Marx say in chapter 3? That's not what it's about. How do we organize? And notions out of French syndicalism, like sabotage, notions from Rosa Luxemburg out of mass action, direct action, all come together, right? So we're looking for another vehicle other than parliaments to transform society because we have I mean, how hard was it for Bernie to get in? You right? Imagine how hard it would be for Debs. They wouldn't allow it to happen, and so people began to look for anti-parliament, or not anti, outside of parliament, what we can do for activities. And it was also clear in the United States this time, socialists were getting elected left, right, and center to local places, and very little would change, right? So finally we got the mayor of Milwaukee as in the Socialist Party, and yeah, Milwaukee was more or less the same it was yesterday. So people were coming into conflict with their own victories, right? We wanted to get people elected, and now we did. And it didn't lead to what we wanted. So people were looking for more. Mary, in this period, begins to lead the editorial line of ISR, and will write on all of these. So she's going to write on war, Milwaukee, a wonderful article about violence, class morality, free speech, immigration. All of these things will be addressed by Mary in her in the editorials. One other issue that I think is important, it's a minor historical issue, but it exemplifies the problems in the real world between the left and the right in the Socialist Party. And that's what happened in West Virginia in 1912, 1913. Some of you may have heard about the Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921, the Battle of Matewan, those kind of things. There was a large conflict a generation before, 1912, 1913, called the Paint Creek, Cabin Creek strike, in which many dozens of people were killed. The Hatfield is the name of the governor, who was a Democrat and pro AFL. And the Socialist Party, because they were pro AFL, supported the agreement that ended that strike and then defended it. The militants on the ground in both the labor, in the UMWA and in the Socialist Party rejected it. And it split the Socialist Party of West Virginia over a real issue of workers organizing. And actually, Mary wrote, and this is one of the few times where Debs was on the other side than the left. I think we think of Debs as a moderate. He was not. He was on the far left of the party. He was hated by the right wing of the party. He was hated by the Milwaukee people. They really did not like Debs. And so when Debs ended up siding with them around the Hatfield situation, Mary wrote an editorial attacking Debs, right? She was not afraid to do that. She was not afraid to do that. Okay, home and social life. As I said, Mary was I, Bohemian makes people seem unserious, right? Countercultural. They absolutely were countercultural. Here is her life partner, Leslie H. Marcy, here on the top right. He's also becomes an editor of ISR. You can see the magazine right there behind him. That's his article, his extremely good article on the Akron rubber strikes in 1912. And remember what we said about relationship with Charles Kerr that Mary had. Charles Kerr will divorce his wife, and then Mary, Leslie, and Charles will all move in together here in this house this little working class house in Chicago. It's still there, 5365 North Bowmanville Avenue. It's not far from where Mary was in boarding house when she was in high school. So the three of them will live together. Um, I I don't know what their relationship was other than it was intimate, right? None of us do. But so even after the affair that happened, the three of them are extraordinarily close. They live their lives together. They go on vacation together, all of that. So, uh, were they all three in a relationship? I have no idea. We won't know. But they were all three deeply intimate, deeply personally and politically connected for the rest of their lives and their families. And we will see that. Now, in Chicago, and one of the things when I was doing this, putting this together, I realized I have a major deficit in understanding Mary. I have a major blank spot, and that is I don't know a whole lot about Chicago. And to me, doing this, I think that you got to know Chicago and the scene of Chicago to really place Mary in her proper context. And she hung out in Chicago in the countercultural parts of Chicago. So Charles Kerr was a vegetarian. And so for them to go out to eat, they would have to find like the only Indian restaurant in Chicago in 1910, right? And there was a place in Chicago called Bug House Square. And then there was a bar, cabaret, club, hole in the wall where anything went called the Dill Pickle, who was eventually run by Jim Larkin. And it was a 1915 bar in Chicago where you could be openly gay, right? It was that kind of place. Here's a discussion on homosexuality at the bar, at the place. Here you see the Dill Pickle Club. They're doing The Girl in the Coffin, cocaine, and then Irish revolutionary Patrick Pierce, right? Like so, and it's a real hole in the wall. And Mary hung out there, put on performances there, probably act in other performances there. It was one of the places they hung out. And it sounds like a fantastic place. It sounds like a place I would like to go to right after this, right? It lasted from about 1912. It was founded by a Wobblies. It was where all the Wobblies hung out and also gangsters and all kind. It was a rough tumble place, and it became more rough and tumble apparently with Prohibition, and was eventually closed down in the 30s. But for a while, the Dill Pickle was the spot. It was for the counterculture and left and for people who didn't fit in, and that's where Mary spent a good deal of her time. Okay, we're moving now into probably a more familiar area for us. One of the things that Mary's articles around, especially around internationalism and the war and opposed to the right, and just the general tone of ISR meant that other people outside of the United States, if they wanted to know what the left was thinking in the United States, would read ISR. So ISR had a long relationship with Dutch revolutionary Anton Pannekoek, who wrote, I think, from the very first year of ISR in 1900. And of course, Pannekoek is a leader of the left wing. A group of Dutch Marxists become very important relationship to ISR. And these are major figures. So Henrietta Roland Host, S.J. Rutgers, who is this man right here, Siebold Rutgers, who, again, I wish we could do he's a remarkable person, Anton Pannekoek, and the great Herman Gorder. So all of those people will write for ISR around the period of World War One. Uh, um, Siebold Rutgers, who you see right there, is a Dutch Marxist who works in the colonial administration in the Dutch East Indies for the Dutch railroads, right? So he has an intimate understanding of colonialism from the inside. And a lot of those Dutch do, because of the Dutch East Indies. So the Indonesian Communist Party is the first Communist Party in Asia because of this early relationship with Dutch comrades, the people from Holland who live in Indonesia. And it becomes a majority, of course, Indonesian party, not a Dutch party in Indonesia. But Herman Gord or but Siebold Rutgers is the company, the railroad company, moves him to the United States in 1915. And the very first thing he does is walk into Mary Marcy's office in Chicago and go, I've been reading your articles. And they start a relationship, a political relationship, which will be extremely important for the future of the US left. This is the man who will introduce us all to Lenin in the United States, right? It's extremely important. Rutgers is going to live in the United States, and he will begin a series in which I highly recommend in ISR in 1915 called The Left Wing, which is about the left wing that was emerging out of the anti-war socialists of the Zimmerwald movement. I know, but it means that in after the catastrophe of World War I began, a left wing emerged, consolidated around the world and met each other. And Rutgers was central to that consolidation. And he comes here and helps bring in ISR into that. The Socialist Party in late 1912 passes at its 1912 meeting passes Article 2, Section 6, puts that into its constitution. And that is designed to say that you cannot be a member of the IWW and the Socialist Party simultaneously. It says you cannot be a member of the Socialist Party and advocate law breaking. I don't know how we're supposed to have a revolution if we don't advocate law breaking. And so that was the right wing putting into the Constitution a way to define out the left. And that created a massive crisis within the Socialist Party. William D. Haywood was recalled from the leadership. He wasn't expelled from the party, but he was booted from the leadership for this violation of this stupid Article 2, Section 6, which, people wore that with pride. A lot of the people who got expelled, would like wear T-shirts saying Article 2, Section 6. But that was a clear statement on the part of the Socialist Party leadership uh, that it probably rejected the majority of its own members, right? That would have meant it might have been a majority of its own members. Around 1912, the Socialist Party in this country was massive. It had about 140,000 members in the country. It had 140 million people. So you do the math. It was much bigger than that would even be today, and it would be massive today. It was a real political party. It was not DSA. It was an independent political party running against Democrats, right? It was its own political party. It had won mayorships. It had won two members of Congress people, Victor Berger and Meyer London. It was a real party. Now, simultaneously with that rightward shift of the party, you get a further radicalization of the working class and their movement in the run up to World War I, the entrance of World War I. So in 1913-14, you get a real class war in this country. Parliamentarism, that's not the way things are solved in the United States. This is a country of guns, right? And guns are brought out to solve the situation where arbitration does not work. And so in West Virginia, in that Paint Creek, Cabin Creek strike is a real civil war, Ludlow, of course, the massacre of Ludlow also led to the massacre of workers at Ludlow by the militia also led to what was called the 10 Days War. We don't often hear about that part of it, but the workers got the better of the militia in the 10 Days War and won many battles in that fight. And then, of course, Calumet in Michigan. So violence, which is always a part of American life and always a part of the class struggle, has become a predominant part as we are starting to enter World War II or World War I. Mary responds to these with some wonderful articles. If I could recommend the Nine Sharpshooters about the workers defending the camps in Colorado is glorious. I think Mary's best article of reporting of a strike is the battle for bread at Lawrence, about the Lawrence, Massachusetts IWW strike. It's probably the best thing ever written on that strike. In fact, it's a fantastic article. Now, Mary and the ISR's internationalism and their position on war has meant that other internationalists are attracted to them. So all of the names you see at the bottom, Sen Katayama, Alexander Kollontai, Rosa Luxemburg, Clara Zetkin, Karl Witt, Franz Mehring, Leon Trotsky, Karl Liebknecht, and then for us in America, Louis Freina, who becomes the leader of American communism, he joins ISR as well. So all of those figures who are major figures in what would become the communist movement are writing for ISR before the Russian Revolution, right? Before the Russian Revolution, and before it's even before 1917, even they're writing for it. And in fact, there's a quite a close relationship both between Kollontai is living in the United States in 1915-16, so she's going to write in the United States. Karl Liebknecht visited the United States in 1910, so he knows many of these people. And of course, Leon Trotsky is living in New York in 1917 and will, in fact, he was scheduled to write an article for ISR when the March Revolution pops off and he heads back with Alexander Kollontai to Russia. So not just right, and these people were also here in the United States. Bukharin was in the United States as well during this period, probably read ISR. So Louis Freina and Leon Trotsky actually form an alliance in the Socialist Party in New York to put forward revolutionary anti-war position in the New York Socialist Party, which is backed up by ISR. So that's ISR is in the front of this fight. Now, World War I happens. And I think most of people on here will understand uh, what that means, but I think I should underline it. The socialist movement around the world was dedicated to preventing a world war. It had meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting calling for peace, for no war. As soon as the war got underway, the majorities of the socialist parties voted in their own parliaments to support the war against the brother and sister parties in other countries. It was a betrayal that led to the worst catastrophe human society had ever known, right? Well, up to that point, we'll have another war 20 years later, but up to that point, World War I was the biggest catastrophe the world had ever known because it was supposed to have been prevented by a rising workers' movement conscious of its task. And not only did it not prevent it, it didn't lift a finger. It didn't even protest it, right? So you have that evolutionary idea. If we can just get out the idea, if we can just win some parliament, that crashes straight into this betrayal, straight into this betrayal. Now, immediately, I think we forget, but America is actually in 1914, they're going to invade Mexico. America will not join World War I until 1917. But in 1914, American imperialism is about to go into Mexico to try to combat the revolution that is happening there. Many IWW people and American radicals are in Mexico fighting with the guerrillas and the insurgents. Joe Hill went to fight with the Liberation Army in northern Mexico. So, before there was Spain, there was Mexico with internationalist brigades going to fight it. And so the Mexican Revolution is a radicalizing force. And it also brings in questions about, it's a real revolution, right? It's not parliament. It's about, armed struggle. It brings in questions about native and indigenous rights. The Yaquis are fighting independently of all the forces of that revolution. Uh, 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 about violence, about all of those kinds of things the Mexican Revolution raises, and imperialism. And so Mary's articles, internationalist articles, begin immediately with against Mexico and against any idea of going to war at all. But there's a real concern that we must keep our movement united. If we get divided in this situation, they will be able to pick us off. Now, there are not one or two positions in the movement over the war. There are multiple positions in the IWW and in the Socialist Party, right? So there's not just a pro-war and anti-war position. That's not it at all. And for people like Mary and ISR, The issue was not what is your position on the war. The issue for Mary was what are you going to do about your position on the war? Anybody can have a position against the war. She wanted to know what are you going to do to stop the war? Because unless we're talking about what we're doing to stop the war, I don't care about your position on the war. That was Mary's idea. So she wanted to know what we're going to do to stop the war. Uh, ISR will be identified with the far left of the Zimmerwald movement. Uh, 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 the notion that we should turn this global imperialist war into a civil war. That Mary embraced in 1914. She never read Lenin, and she embraced that immediately, right? As the logical, by civil war, I mean raise the conflict, the class conflict in the United States to such a pitch that it would prevent the war or demoralize the war, stop the war. We don't want our children dying in this war. So she writes these wonderful, and these are actually some of the few writings of Mary's to be collected and published after her death are her anti-war writings, which were a small collection, I think in the early 80s. Somebody online may know, I think it was 1983, but she writes these wonderful editorials, The Real Fatherland, Fighting Instincts, which we'll talk about in a moment, better any kind of action than inert theory, and we must fight it out. Then she also says what happened in Germany. This German party was the lead party, so she has to figure out what happened to the German party as well. She makes a lot of really profound realizations about that. Now, the splits in the we wish that looking back that you would just kind of know the left wing would be anti-war, the right would. That's not the way it happened. And in ISR, there were splits within the left wing with some people that, if you knew them in 1915, would never believe that in 1917 they were going to support the war. But I think that shows us what a kind of catastrophe this war was. People like Frank Baum, who is the leader of the left wing with and a brilliant writer, one of the most brilliant left wing writers the American left has ever produced, and sharp and a really remarkable figure, he will collapse in this process. Gustav Myers, who wrote this on the Supreme Court and the Democratic, he will collapse in this process. William English Walling. These are people who led the left wing in 1910, 1911. They will collapse in face of World War I. Politically, they will collapse. Not Mary. It seems that she gets harder and harder and harder. The left wing is growing, but it's also growing culturally, and so we get new magazines competing with ISR like New Review, The Masses, and Socialist Review. And then you can see the anti-war dance at the Del Pickle Club. I wonder if Mary was there. Okay, revolution and repression. So 1917 is the year of the Russian Revolution, but I think we need to remember that there's many revolutions happening in this period. So let's step back a little bit and talk about World War I level repression. Uh, People have heard about the Red Summer, 1919, in the Black Red Scare. It begins in the summer of 1917, and it doesn't end until today. It's still going on. In fact, those first Red Scares became institutionalized in the 20s, right? So we never got over them. We institutionalized them. And in 19 beginning in with the beginning of the war, it was always dangerous to be a union activist or especially organizing unskilled or black workers. And now it would become deadly, right? And so you see Joe Hill is executed in December 19 or in late 1915. The Everett massacre happens. I'm not going to go into detail about all of these. Frank Little is lynched in August 1917 in Butte. Centralia happens. The Bisbee deportations, where they literally rounded up the entire workforce of striking workforce of a town in Arizona and drove them to the Mexican or the New Mexican desert and left them out there for months. And then the Mesaba strikes violence in northern Minnesota. So we've got severe repression of any worker strikes. We have the Mexican German, Irish, Hungarian, Russian, and do not forget the Chinese Revolution did not begin in 1949. It began in 1911 and 1912, right? And going through a huge transformational wave. Mary has about half a dozen articles on the changes in China. In 1917, there's an emergency Socialist Party conference on the war, and around that period, Mary leaves the Socialist Party. She's had enough. And I think it's the inability to turn the anti-war resolution into practical measures. So Mary wants a general strike to stop the war. She wants strikes on at the docks, in the munitions factories. And if we can't have strikes to stop it, we should demoralize the army. This is what Mary was thinking, right? That's a Civil War position. And the Socialist Party's position was, we're against the war, but we're not going to do anything about it, which was absolutely unacceptable for many people in the Socialist Party, which had become more left wing in 1917, with many of the old left wing that had kind of fallen out rejoining it. ISR becomes a center of repression. In 1917, summer raids on the IWW and socialist parties in Chicago. Haywood is arrested, mass arrests, hundreds are arrested. Many are deported. Virtually the entire leadership of the IWW is put in Leavenworth prison or on barges in New York Harbor. International Socialist, the Espionage Act is passed in 1917, and under the Espionage Act, International Socialist Review loses its mailing privileges. And so you can't mail it out. And so if you can't mail out your magazine, you have no way to get it out, right? And so by 1918, virtually every left newspaper in the United States is shut down. It's gone. It's over. Uh, Mary tries to her and Kerr try to get labor scrapbook together. Mary, at this point, I think likely in 1918, possibly in 1919, joins the IWW after all of these years in the Socialist Party. She joins the IWW. I think one, she needed an organization, but out of solidarity with and to be able to defend them. And then the situation here is now mass propaganda to mass action. Like this situation does not require propaganda. This situation requires action. And we are not in a position to enforce our actions. And so this was a failure, right? So just at the same time you have the Russian Revolution, you have the greatest failure of the American socialist movement, right? Both at the same time, exactly at the same time. And so what that looks like for Mary is an end of that evolutionary process and what I would say is a renewal and struggle, right? The only way to get out of this situation is action, is to actually struggle. It's not, we can't think our way out of this situation in this context. And so any struggle that we engage in is an act of building for the future. Uh, After ISR is shut down, Mary continues writing. She is an incredibly prolific writer. My aim, and I would appreciate any help, people on this. My aim is to have the complete works of Mary Marcy up. I would like to get everything she ever wrote publicly up. I have I think we're at about 140 articles. My guess is there's over 300. And then there's also these her pamphlets that she put out. Some of them published in small batches, some of them published in others. You can see the multiple languages Mary is translated into. She is one of the most translated writers I have ever seen for somebody that we don't know about. Okay, we're going to head now towards the wrapping this up. 1919 is the key year for the socialist movement around the world. It's the foundation of the Third International. It's the defeat of the German Revolution, the Hungarian Revolution. It's the beginning of the Irish Revolution. It's the split of the Socialist Party in the United States. So Mary is not a member of the Socialist Party when that 1919 split happens that creates multiple communist parties. And she's not a member uh, in the 2 years preceding that, in which the formal left wing was created, right? So she does not participate organizationally in those movements. She's outside of those movements. And in part, I think Mary is absolutely done with sitting in a group of men arguing about whose theories are better. She's done with that. She's done with that. But she is intervening. So in September 1919, the entire socialist movement gathers in for an emergency conference in Chicago, which will lead to the split, the creation of multiple communist and socialist parties. Mary goes to that and she distributes her position, a leaflet calling for one single revolutionary party. And so she is still actively intervening. She's at that. She's intervening with her position. She is certainly close to the like Bill Haywood, uh, James P. Cannon, Jim Larkin, John Reed, all of the people who joined the communist movement out of the IWW, that wing of people, and there were many, many, many. I mean, the IWW gave the communist movement many of its early best organizers, and that group was called the Communist Labor Party. So Mary, if she was going to be around one group in those multiple splits, at least personally and politically closest she was to was clearly the Communist Labor Party, and she writes for John Reed's. She writes for their press, and she, Emma, she is absolutely supportive of the Russian Revolution. She embraces the dictatorship of the proletariat. She writes if anybody has seen Reds, and the argument between John Reed and Emma Goldman, I wonder if John Reed read Mary Marcy's article to open letter to Emma Goldman, because it's virtually verbatim. Uh, uh, there was no lost love at all between Mary Marcy and Emma Goldman. Mary Marcy had no time for Emma Goldman. And when Emma turned against the Russian Revolution, Mary let her have it with both barrels. Now, I think Mary politically, and again, we don't know where she was, right? We don't she was not in these organizations. She chose not to be in these organizations. Uh, these organizations were split and arguing with each other. She was for them all joining, as was the Communist International. In fact, it would not recognize any of the single groups as a member of the Communist International until they all joined together. And it took about 3 years to do that after Mary passes away. So that process is taking place in 1919, 1920, 1930. And she's not interested in that process. I can tell you that. I think if Mary, looking at the Dutch comrades that she was close to, I think Mary probably would have developed into what we would call a left communist. People like Anton Pannekoek, Karl Korsch, those. I mean, I can't say that definitively, but that seems to me where her politics were at that time, and she was very close politically. Not all of those Dutch comrades became left communists. Some of them, S.J. Rutgers became a leading member of the Communist International. But my guess is, given her anti-parliamentarism, given her grassroots organizing, my guess is that she would have been attracted to what we would call left communism, Bordigaism, Paul. I don't know what else to call it. Okay, she is a member of the IWW in this period, though, and she's going to the conferences. So she writes a report on the very tough 1919 conference. She writes for One Big Union and Industrial Pioneer and several pamphlets. But this process of the splintering of the socialist movement. Remember, Debs is in jail. Debs is also not around for any of these debates because he's in federal prison for sedition. James Connolly, her old comrade from who was part of their world, he wrote for ISR, is executed in 1916. ISR clearly comments on that quite a bit. That was very hard. Their leaders are dying. Joe Hill was not nobody. Frank Little was a top leader, and in fact, Frank Little was the member of the general executive board of the IWW. Even not Bill Haywood, who demanded the IWW oppose World War II militantly. These were not minor figures, and Haywood's um, Haywood got out on bail while his appeals were underway, and to get him out on bail, Mary put up her house, and a bunch of other people put up their houses and homes, and Haywood lost the appeal and was facing the rest of his life in Leavenworth prison, and decided to escape to Moscow. So Mary loses her home, or we think loses her home in this process. And even if she doesn't, she loses her people in this process. The FBI is raiding her house and following her. She comes to the office and finds everything out of thrown on the floor. There are mass deportations. There's surveillance and harassment. She's also has some medical difficulties, and those are a little bit unclear, but there's a period for 3 months and then another 3 months period where she's not on ISR. She's clearly dealing with medical issues. Yeah, I don't know what they are. And then there's the work and financial strain. This is where is Marcy going to get a job? Who is going to hire Mary Marcy? Only Charles H. Kerr at this point, and they can't put out ISR, right? And so it's a real financial strain. She never made much money, but they did okay, right? So this is the most difficult time. This is the revolution has retreated, right? She greeted 1917, 1819 with enthusiasm. That wave has retreated, and reality is very brutal at this point. I think at this point I do want to say something about Rosa Luxemburg and Mary. I think probably some of you are making inescapable comparisons between Rosa and Mary. Rosa and Mary are very different in many different ways. Mary is not a theoretician in the sense that Rosa was. She doesn't write long theoretical works. She doesn't write long book reviews. Mary's formal education was extremely limited compared to Rosa Luxemburg's, but it is undeniable that there are similarities between these two, not just the political positions they took, but the stature, both their physical and moral stature within the movements, the divisions they caused. I mean, it is their and Mary certainly would have known Rosa Luxemburg's writings. She published it in ISR, several of Rosa's works. So I think that there would be a rich study in looking at Mary and Rosa together. But I don't think that I think that they're far enough apart that they shouldn't always be spoken of in the same breath. Okay, we're wrapping up here. Now I want to say a couple of things about, we said a little bit about women suffrage and feminism. These are two late books that Mary wrote, and they're both connected to her family, which is wonderful. So Women as Sex Vendors, with that title, was sure to get many eyes raised. She wrote with her brother, and I think a lot of feminists at the time really disliked it. I think they missed what Mary was trying to say. Mary was trying to explain a kind of the reputation of women as having a political conservativeness at that time. And she was trying to explain the origins of that political conservativeness. And for her, the origin was having to exchange sex with men for the means to live. And so they were dependent on men's stability. And the only way for women to get out of that situation was to have complete independence financially from men, which was only possible under socialism. So it is not an anti-feminist argument at all. I think it has been misread. But again, it doesn't really matter. Mary was engaging with these ideas. She was really engaging with these ideas. Then there's this one, and my partner and I, Lisa, are dying to put this on. This was actually produced at the Dill Pickle, and it is dedicated to her sister, which we'll see in a moment, Hazel. And it's a free union, a one-act comedy of free love, and it is about the idea of a multiple relationship, a menage a trois, and the reality of it. And knowing what we know about her life and who she lived with, we can't help but think that this is something from her own experience. Certainly, it is free love, and that bohemian world was the world she lived in. So it's certain, those relationships were part of her experience largely. And again, we talked already about her positions, So while Mary didn't identify as a feminist, she didn't go to women's meet. Her positions on all of these questions were far to the left of almost everybody who called themselves a feminist. So in my mind, Mary is a leading feminist, a leading feminist. So at the end of her life, um, Mary is spending more and more time at a commune in Mobile, Alabama. It's an old single tax commune that Kerr had bought a property in the late 1890s. And they started to get out of Chicago, right? During this period, she started spending more and more time with her sister, got divorced, and is living with her now. So her sister is also living with them, and the whole Kerr Marcy crew goes down to Alabama quite a bit. And in Alabama, she meets this man named Wharton Esherick, and I don't think that there's a relationship there. I think that this is a political relationship, who's living there, and they begin a project which is Mary's last project, which is the Rhymes of the Early Jungle Folk, which is Mary. You know how we did that revolution? Now Mary's going all the way back to the long view. Okay, we didn't win it here. Let's take this long view. And she's writing poems on science and evolution with wonderful artistic woodcuts by this man, Wharton Esherick. It's going to be published posthumously because on December 4th, 1922, back home in Illinois, Mary Marcy, at the age of 45, declares, I want rest. I want no funeral. I want no flowers, cremation. She took poison on the 4th, and 4 days later, she passed away. Those those were observed. All of those wishes were observed, and Rhymes of Early Jungle Folk came out posthumously right after her death. It is a singular piece of art. It is the whole thing from top to bottom is a piece of art. I'm sure that Mary, I'm not sure about anything. I don't know if Mary was planning this earlier. We have very little information because of the repression. The Kerr Company and Mary burned and destroyed many of their notes and letters to keep them out of the hands of the feds. So we don't have a lot of information at this. And because Mary took her own life, it was considered unseemly to speak about. And so we don't get a lot of obituaries of this leading figure, this absolutely leading figure, uh, uh, because it was considered untoward to speak of. Well, we do have this note that Eugene Debs wrote to Leslie on hearing it, and I'm going to read it if I can get through it without choking up. My dear Leslie Marcy, your message containing the very sad, heartbreaking news has just come into my hands. How deeply pained and cruelly shocked I feel to hear of your dear Mary's going out cannot be expressed on this cold sheet of paper. What a thousand pities this noble heart should have ceased to beat, and this brilliant mind to think in the very morning of life. It is impossible for me to realize what you say, and my heart refuses to believe that Mary Marcy is dead. I did not see her often, but I knew her well, and I loved and honored her more than well. She was one of the clearest minds and greatest souls in all our movement, and her passing into the great silence will be such a loss as will leave an aching void to those who knew her, for her place can never be filled. I admired her for her uncompromising integrity, and I loved her for her high-souled devotion to her ideals and her personal loyalty to her comrades. She was a sweet, fine, brilliant, and truly noble little woman, and her precious memory will be sacredly cherished by me to the last of my life. The Book of Mary's, her last contribution to the cause, has just come and is in my hands, and I am thanking her and you through my tears. It is a rare volume and one which we shall treasure among our garnered riches and most treasured possessions. Leslie, dear comrade, Our hearts are with you, and we share your bereavement as her soul goes marching on and grows more radiant with the passing years. With love, sympathy, and tears, Eugene Debs. So, the legacy of Mary Marcy. Let's look at these first three photos first. The bottom left is Charles H. Kerr later in life with Mary's sister. They all lived together and they would marry. So Mary's sister Inez would become Charles's partner, and they would live together until Charles died in 1944, and Inez, Mary's sister, would die in 1972. So make of that what you will. On the right is Roscoe Toby, and that picture is taken by Ralph Chaplin, and it's on a fishing trip to the Alsable River in northern Michigan. And in 1918 and 19, Roscoe is arrested by the FBI with dynamite. We don't know what he was doing with that dynamite, but there were some bombings going on around that time. He did a little more time. He stayed in the IWW, and as Prohibition started, he began an underground speakeasy for drinking wobblies in Chicago. He found out in 1930 that he had brain cancer and committed suicide. He took his own life at that point. But he also was remained political until the end of his life. And in the middle there, you see the woodcutter who did the last piece of Marcy, Charles H. Kerr, and a great Irish revolutionary named Jack Carney, who was a comrade of Mary Marcy's, put out a small memorial, which is in fact the only real biography we have of Marcy, and there's some incorrect things in it, but they put out a very small memorial written by Jack Carney for Mary Marcy, which is where the Debs letter comes from, and then the Esterick created this woodcut for Mary Marcy, which goes on the top, and it says, "Cheerful companion, enthusiastic encourager, willing worker, Mary Marcy." And then I think I can't think of another line that from Mary, and comes from an editorial called "We Must Fight It Out," where she thinking about the failure of the Germans and all of their ideas to be able to stop the war. She says the class war will have to be fought out, and every act of rebellion and revolt will make us better fighters for the overthrow of capitalism. Fighters with weapon tried and found effective. Revolt, revolt again, and again revolt. That is Mary Marcy's message to us today. So thank you very much for sticking in. And if there's any chat, I'll be happy to take a couple of questions on the chat.